So today I want to go over what's one of the best speed farming builds in Season 12 of Diablo 4 and what's also the best speed farming build for the Druid. This is going to be a Cataclysm Druid build, which is just incredibly easy to use because if you're not in very hard content, you essentially just pop Cataclysm and run around while it kills everything. So it's very good for this season of kill streaks. And this isn't going to be the final version of this build because I've gotten incredibly unlucky and I haven't gotten any mythics to use with this build. Once I get those, or if you have them, that'll be a pretty massive power increase, but you do need a good chunk of uniques for this build to work or to be incredibly strong. So first off, Tempest Roar. There's actually some really good stats on this item. You have willpower percent and then max resource, which in this build for Cataclysm is essentially a multiplicative damage increase. But the primary reason we're using this, your base storm skills are now also werewolf skills. This just adds a massive amount of additional scaling and power increases for our Cataclysm. Then Insatiable Fury, it keeps us in Werebear, which is pretty nice to help keep things stacking and to keep some of our buffs on us at all times, but it also gives some good defensives, and Urzine Strength bonuses, which is our capstone, will also give us some pretty massive power increases. Tibalt Will for our legs, we will be unstoppable a good chunk of the time, so just a damage increase. The stats on this are also pretty good, and again, maximum resource, which again is more multiplicative damage for our Cataclysm. Then for both of our rings, we're using Mjolnir Ring, which just gives us a multiplicative damage increase for the entirety of the time Cataclysm is active. And this Tempest increase is really good to keep both our Hurricane and Cataclysm up a lot of the time. And then movement speed increase is also nice if you don't have cap move speed because you'll have Cataclysm up 100% of the time anyway. Then finally, we have the Inexorable Will, which when we cast our ultimate, it just pulls enemies in and deals some damage, which is pretty nice, but the stats are the real reason we're using this. Ultimate cooldown reduction, you're definitely going to need this with at least a decent roll to be able to keep your Cataclysm up 100% of the time, and then another percent willpower increase is also pretty good. And then we have the abilities on our skill tree. 1 point into a basic, but you're not really using it. 1 point in a pulverize. At a baseline, this is primarily to spend spirit, but then upgrade 1 makes it deal increased damage to bosses, but upgrade 2 is another reason we're using it. Every 10 seconds we do pulverize an enemy, they take 20% more damage from you for 5 seconds. You want to be using this specifically on things like bosses, so once it's stacked up to 10 times, use it on a boss, they take massively increased damage from us. Then 1 point in a Cyclone Armor. When it's on your bar, you get the non-physical damage reduction at all times. 1 point in an Earthen Bulwark as a big barrier. This will also help us stack some pretty massive damage increases for our Cataclysm. Upgrade 1 makes you unstoppable. Upgrade 2 fortifies you, which is actually our only fortify. You don't fortify a lot in this build just because it's not super strong anymore. Then 1 point into Hurricane. Upgrade 1 slows enemies. Upgrade 2 makes enemies deal less damage, just for some pretty good utility. 1 point into Trample for the unstoppable and for the movement. Then 5 points into Cataclysm, our main damaging ability. Also, when you put 5 points into it, it slows everything around you when you use it. Cataclysm's duration is increased for upgrade 1. Upgrade 2, everything is vulnerable, so we don't have to worry about vulnerable. Then we have our passives, 3 into Iron Fur for damage reduction while in Werebear, 3 into Enchanted Fortitude for non-physical resistance increases, 3 into Backlash for increased damage after using a defensive, 3 into Nature's Reach, increased damage to distant enemies, more damage if they're CC'd, 3 into Pharaoh Aptitude, increased damage while healthy, and even more when above 100% move speed, 3 into Endless Tempest, increase the duration of Cataclysm and Hurricane, 3 into Charged Atmosphere. Every 3 seconds a lightning bolt hits an enemy to deal damage. Your lightning bolts deal more damage, and we actually have a lot of damage increases for Lightning Bolt because our ultimate does a majority of its damage through Lightning Bolt. Then 3 into Bad Omen, which is a lucky hit, up to a 30% chance when damaging a vulnerable enemy. Everything will be vulnerable for a Lightning Bolt to spawn and hit that enemy, so just more damage. Then we have 1 into Neurotoxin to get 3 into Toxic Claws for increased poison damage, 3 into Envenom for increased critical strike damage against poison enemies, 3 into Provocation. Every 10 seconds in Werebear form, your next non-defensive skill will overpower and deal more damage. This is actually the most important passive in the build because if you snapshot Cataclysm with something that'll make it overpower, every attack of that Cataclysm will then overpower. So anytime you cast Cataclysm, you want to make sure you have Provocation up, which Provocation will show how many stacks it has. Once it's at 10 stacks, the next thing you use will cause it to overpower. So you make sure this symbol on your buff bar is at 10 stacks. It'll have a 10 10 on it, then you use your Cataclysm. Will make your Cataclysm be all overpowers, which will just massively increase his damage. You'll do very little damage unless you use Cataclysm with Provocation. Then 3 into Defiance, nature skills do increase damage to elites. 2 into Natural Disasters, so your storm skills do increase damage to CC to enemies. Then 3 into Resonant, nature skills do increase damage. Triple this if an earth skill is a next skill after a storm skill, and vice versa. We can actually get this tripling of this damage bonus by just using your Earthen Bulwark before you use Cataclysm. So essentially the two things you want to look out for is you're just waiting for Provocation. Once that's stacked up, you then pop your Earthen Bulwark and then you pop Cataclysm. This will make every hit of your Cataclysm be overpowers. They'll do more damage from Provocation. Then you'll get the triple stacking bonus of Resonance for massively increased damage. And that's really all you need to do with this build is you make sure you get 10 stacks of Provocation so it procs and everything overpowers, and you just Earthen Bulwark, then Cataclysm, and you're good to go. That'll stack up the damage increases you need. And then 3 into Catastrophe, increase damage after using your ultimate, which will just give us a pretty massive damage increase. 3 into Quick Shift, shapeshifting into a new animal form gives you damage increase stacking up, and this will just naturally stack up very easily when you're in combat. Then 3 into Heightened Senses, Werebear gives you damage reduction, Werewolf gives you increased movement speed. These stay stacked when you're in any animal form. Then for our capstone, increase max life, do more damage and more overpower damage while in Werebear, which this will just always be up because we're always going to be in Werebear, or majority of the time. Then we have our Paragon boards. For board 1, we're using the Headhunter glyph, which is a bonus to normal nodes within range. The secondary is increased damage to elites. The legendary is increased damage. The first board, we're going to be taking Lust for Carnage. Critical strikes with werewolf skills, restore 2 spirit, deal massively increased damage. As I mentioned, we're using Tempest Roar, so our Cataclysm is also a werewolf skill. So this will then allow us to use Lust for Carnage for massive damage increase. The glyph we're taking is Earth and Sky, a bonus to magic nodes within range. Secondaries increase nature damage to CC to vulnerable. Legendaries increase nature magic damage. Then over to the right, we are taking Survival Instincts. While in Werebear, deal increased damage, even more while at full life. And then, depending on the life difference between you and the enemy, you deal increased overpower damage. And again, we are primarily in Werebear, so that will allow us to use Survival Instincts. The glyph we're taking is Dominate for increased overpower damage. The secondary, when you overpower an enemy, they take increased damage from you. The legendary is increased overpower damage. And if you play the build right, all of your attacks will be overpowers. Then we're going all the way over to the left. We're taking Thunderstruck. Storm skills do increased damage and have an increased critical strike chance, which is very good. Glyph for taking a Spirit for increased critical strike damage. When you crit an enemy, they take increased damage from you stacking up. Then the legendary is increased critical strike damage. Then the final board is Ancestral Guidance. After spending 75 Spirit, you deal increased damage for 5 seconds. And even though it'll say your Pulverize doesn't take any Spirit, it still counts it as using Spirit. So you Pulverize, I think, 3 times, and it will give you this damage increase. Now, the secondary part of this is actually the most important. Your ultimate skills deal increased damage per spirit when cast. So however much max spirit you have when you use Cataclysm, you'll get a damage increase for every one of those spirits, and it's multiplicative. So that's why you want spirit on a good amount of items. You want any spirit you can get through your Paragon boards. Like right here, we have max spirit, max spirit, max spirit. So those are also very good. So get as much max spirit through your Paragon boards, and you even want to use the max spirit elixir because that's all just multiplicative damage. The final glyph is Electrocution, which increases our lightning bolt and dancing bolt damage, but enemies damaged by your lightning bolt or dancing bolts take increased damage from you, and then the legendaries increase lightning damage. Now this is very good because lightning bolts is essentially what the majority of our damage through our Cataclysm is dealing, so just massive damage increases through this as well. Then for our spirit boons, you want Gift of the Stag for increased max spirit. That's all you want it for. So it's a 30% multiplicative increase. Then you want Iron Feather for increased max life. Then Avian Wraith for increased critical strike damage. Then you're going to want Calamity to extend the duration of your ultimate. Now, if you have enough duration on your ultimate and you're, say, trying to do a bit harder content that can kill you a lot, you can use Bolster, which you fortify for 50% of your max life after using a defensive. So this means you'll have a Fortify the whole time, but fortifying now is just healing. So that's not as important as you would normally think. So you would really need a lot of ultimate cooldown to just have your ultimate up at all times without Calamity. Then Overload, dealing damage with storm skills, lightning bolts, and dancing bolts, apply poison. so everything's poisoned instantly, and then dealing poison damage has a chance to summon the lightning bolt, which we have a lot of lightning bolt damage increase, so this is just a pretty decent damage increase. Now, if you're lesser geared, you can use Comfort for the Storm, which is a lucky hit to reduce your ultimate cooldown. That's only if you need it and you don't have the full build created yet. Comfort for the Storm can help to keep your ultimate up at all times. Then we have our mercenaries, and the only thing that's really important is using Subo for his tracking, just to be able to keep up your kill streaks, especially if you're in something like Helltide, and also his final passive, when he hits something with it, the enemy takes 25% increased critical strike damage from you, which will be nice on things specifically like bosses. I've just still been using Variana with Bloodthirst. Your reinforcement really doesn't matter. You can use a different reinforcement such as Rahir to get more defensive aspects if you're dying or in harder content that's going to be dealing a lot more damage. But then that brings us into our gear, starting with our runes and our gems. For our armor, you want 2 pieces of increases to willpower. In your jewelry, you want all diamonds for increased resistances. Then for our rune sets, the first one is travel some amount of meters, so the Bach rune, and then the Jaw rune, which will replace your evade with the sorcerer teleport. Massive movement speed increase, and this mode is focused on speed farming, so that's going to be very good. And then we're using Neo Vex, so avoid taking damage while fighting for 2 seconds, and this will give you an increase to all skills up to 3. Now, the reason this is actually good is because getting skill increases to your ultimate is generally pretty hard, because you can only do it in some very specific ways, and even one additional skill increase for your ultimate is a lot of damage, which is why we're generally taking this. It's also pretty easy to not get hit when you're using Cataclysm build, because Cataclysm hits enemies off screen and you can just keep walking around while it's killing everything. And we already went over our uniques, so that brings us into our legendary aspects. On your weapon, you want Rabid Bear for deal increased poison damage, and while shapeshift, your direct damage is converted into poison. This will just give us a lot of damage conversion, and this gives us massively increased damage already just by being at a 2-hander. On your necklace, you deal increased damage while hitting a poison enemy in Werebear, which is going to be our primary thing. Everything's poison the first time it gets hit, and we're always going to be in Werebear, so just a massive damage increase. On our final offensive aspect, you're going to want critical strikes with storm skills cause lightning bolts to periodically strike close enemies for 3 seconds, each dealing lightning damage, and your lightning bolts deal massively increased damage, which a majority of our damage are lightning bolts, so just more lightning bolt procs, more lightning bolt damage. Then for our final legendary aspect on our boots, while Hurricane is active, gain 5 ranks to your shapeshifting skills, and again, Cataclysm is a shapeshifting skill, so this will give us 5 more ranks of Cataclysm, which is very good for its overall damage. Now, a couple important stats. Obviously, on your necklace, try to get just as many passive increases as you can, but cooldown reduction will be nice on your necklace. You want cooldown reduction on your gloves, and then on your 2-handed weapon, you want the Temperic for a chance for Cataclysm to deal double damage. You can get this 100%, which is really all you need. That's incredibly strong. And also getting Berserking as your bloodied weapon roll is very good, because you could keep that up basically 100% of the time, and that's another multiplicative damage increase. And then finally, on your boots, you do want a movement speed roll and then a tempering movement speed roll on your boots. Make sure to try to get your tempering roll on your boots of movement speed as a greater affix. Remember, you can keep re-rolling your temperings to get a greater affix, and you'll know it's a greater affix when you're re-rolling because it won't show a stat range when you actually get the roll. So try to get that so you have a max movement speed, because it is a speed farming build. Move speed is very important. But that's the entirety of this speed farming Cataclysm build for the Druid. This is probably the best season for this, even though Cataclysm Druid isn't the strongest for pure hard content. This is by far and away the best speed farming build for the Druid, and it's just so incredibly easy to use to keep up those kill streaks. Just earlier today, I was able to multiple times solo get up to the over 9,000 kill streak in Helltides, just because Cataclysm is so easy to keep up your kill streaks with. Again, it can hit enemies off screen, which I think is one of the strongest parts about it. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.
Devastation!